agree to get their troops out of Kosovo and allow NATO forces in, or else airstrikes. If an agreement is reached, U.S. Marines, now on ships in the Adriatic, will be the first of 4,000 American troops in a NATO force 30,000 strong. A commitment President Clinton announced almost out of sight near the end of his Saturday radio address the day after he was acquitted by the Senate.
Anytime we send troops, we must be mindful of the risks. But if these conditions are met, if there is an effective agreement and a clear plan, I believe America should contribute to securing peace for Kosovo.
There is no exit strategy.
Former Congressman Lee Hamilton, a Democrat who chaired the Foreign Relations Committee, fears American troops could be stuck in Kosovo for a very long time.
If you get an agreement, it's a 3-year interim agreement. It doesn't solve anything except stopping the violence, which is very, very helpful, but it does not solve the underlying political problem. So not only will those forces be there for the 3 years, I think it's likely they'll be there much longer.
Overshadowing all this is the lesson of Bosnia. In 1995, President Clinton promised the American military commitment there would be brief.
Our Joint Chiefs of Staff have concluded that this mission should and will take about 1 year.
More than 3 years later, nearly 7,000 American troops remain in Bosnia. This time, administration officials have been careful to not make similar promises about Kosovo. But many in Congress, including Republican Senator McCain, a possible presidential candidate, are giving only grudging support.
There's enormous skepticism out there, and even anger on the part of some, particularly the way that the administration blatantly deceived us on the issue of how long troops would be in Bosnia. So there's an enormous credibility gap out there.
NATO troops, should they go into Kosovo, would ostensibly try to prevent bloodshed like the massacres of Albanians blamed on Serbian forces and attacks on the Serbs blamed on the Kosovo Liberation Army. Unlike Bosnia, where NATO troops separate ethnic factions in clearly marked zones, in Kosovo, troops would blanket the entire province, about the size of Connecticut. The risks are significant, according to ABC News military consultant Anthony Cordes.
When you insert yourself into a conflict like this, one side sooner or later sees you as an ally, and the other sees you as an enemy. And then you become a target or a hostage or a pawn in the political game they're playing as part of their conflict.
If the talks break down, NATO airstrikes could begin with cruise missile attacks launched by Navy ships in the Mediterranean. They would likely be followed within days by fighters and bombers launching strikes against Serb targets.
Serbia is not Iraq, and Serbia is not Kosovo. The Serbian armed forces are considerable, and their sophistication is much greater than many of these armies we've been dealing with. So the risks to American pilots and NATO forces are great.
In Iraq, meanwhile, the risks to American pilots have been growing too.
Flash.
Since Operation Desert Fox ended in December, American and British fighters and bombers have attacked more than 40 Iraqi targets in retaliation for more than 90 violations of the northern and southern no-fly zones. Most of the punishment has been inflicted on Iraqi air defenses, knocking out up to 20% of their system. But last month, one missile misfired, killing at least 17 civilians, according to Iraqi reports, and Saddam is now offering cash bounties for shooting down American planes.
Since Desert Fox, Saddam has almost desperately sought to have some kind of victory, to shoot down at least one Allied aircraft. He also has tried to manipulate the losses of civilians, to the extent there have been any, by turning them into martyrs.
Beyond patrolling the no-fly zones and containing Iraq from developing its more sinister weapons, the Clinton administration has suggested it is also trying to destabilize Saddam.
We will intensify our engagement with the Iraqi opposition groups, prudently and effectively. And we will stand ready to help a new leadership in Baghdad that abides by its international commitments and respects the rights of its own people.
The trouble is, even the commander of American forces in the Persian Gulf, General Anthony Zinni, was openly skeptical in a recent Senate hearing.
So there are 91 opposition groups, 91. We follow every one of those opposition groups in great detail. I will be honest, I don't see an opposition group that has the viability to overthrow Saddam at this point.
So in Iraq and Bosnia and now in Kosovo, the Clinton administration's policies and military commitments are coming under increasing scrutiny.
There's a deep mistrust of the president, not just because of the impeachment process, but because of past promises on Bosnia and other matters, so that a large number of members of Congress today simply don't trust the president.
In both parties?
In both parties, but more in the Republican than the Democratic Party. So the president doesn't have a reservoir there of trust to work on.
It is against that backdrop that American forces are about to join the NATO effort on Kosovo. One way or another, by air or on the ground, U.S. troops are once again headed into harm's way. And this time, no one knows how long they may stay. This is Chris Bury for Nightline in Washington.
Has the administration justified another open-ended commitment of U.S. troops? When we come back, we'll ask the Undersecretary of State, the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces in Europe, and a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Secretary of State for Political Affairs. From West Point, New York, retired four-star General George Jalwin, the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces in Europe. And from Lawton, Oklahoma, Senator James Inhofe, chairman of the Readiness Subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Ambassador Pickering, is stopping the bloodshed reason enough for sending U.S. troops into Kosovo?
It's an important reason, Chris. It's not the only reason. A major reason is the fact that this is an area now of great insecurity and great instability. It threatens the neighborhood, Macedonia, Albania, Montenegro. It could really, I think, spread if it is not dealt with carefully to our allies in Greece and Turkey. So it is an important problem from the security side. But the humanitarian side is equally important. We've had the massacre at Rachak. This summer we had 250 to 300,000 Albanians pushed into the hills. Before the October crisis, it looked like 70,000 would be spending the winter alone in the ice and snow up in the woods. It is, from that point of view, extremely important. It is also important that NATO, in its leadership role in Europe, exercise its useful and valuable influence to bring this particularly dangerous situation to a halt. And the negotiations now going on are designed to achieve that.
General Jalwin, let me ask you what Ambassador Pickering just said, both from a humanitarian standpoint and a strategic standpoint. Reason enough to commit U.S. forces?
I believe so. I would say that it's also important to do it right, that when we commit forces, we're very clear on their objectives, the rules of engagement, and the command structure. But we have a new dynamic taking place in NATO, and the new NATO, as it adapts to its new missions, I think it has to go through the Balkans, and NATO has to come to grips with what is occurring in the Balkans, and that includes Kosovo.
Senator Inhofe, are you satisfied that the U.S. has a good reason for getting in and a good plan for getting out?
No, I'm not at all satisfied, and I disagree with the other two guests. I'm really concerned about it. As chairman of the Readiness Subcommittee, I can tell you we're not ready, and we're diluting our assets. We've had more deployments to areas where we don't have national security interests in this administration than we have in the last 3 administrations combined. I'm very much concerned about it. I've been to Kosovo. I tried to have an open mind, and when I got over there, I found that it's not just a matter of one bad guy and one good guy. In fact, the 2 dead soldiers I saw when I was there, we turned them over. They're both Serbs. They've been shot at point blank. Now, it's not that we're not compassionate. It'd be awfully nice if we had the resources to go all around the world. There are some 60 civil wars going on right now. We don't have it. We shouldn't have gone into Bosnia to begin with. We certainly should not go into Kosovo.
Ambassador Pickering, Senator Inhofe brings up a point that a lot of critics do, and they say the problem is the same as the one in Bosnia, that as long as we're there, the killing may stop, but what's the exit plan, and what happens once we leave?
I think it's important the American people know that we have a clear exit plan. The exit plan is based on an agreement that's now being negotiated, which we hope will be achieved before Saturday. That agreement provides for the demilitarization of the region, for the permissive entry of NATO forces, of which we're only 14% or less. It provides for the creation of a local police force over 1 year, electoral processes to elect local leaders, an autonomy for the region of Kosovo, which, as you know, is 90% or more Albanian, an effort to develop not only self-government but law and order. The Serbs are to all pull out with the exception of some troops on the border. It is, in my view, a very clear exit plan and a clear strategy that provides a future for the people of Kosovo, not in any way at all to be influenced in the way they have by the Serbs from outside. This particular approach, in our view, has a very good chance of establishing benchmarks over a period of time under which forces will gradually be drawn down and then withdrawn. The final effort after 3 years of autonomy... But there is no deadline,
is there, Ambassador Pickering?
We learned in Bosnia, and you just repeated it, that setting a deadline, particularly one that looks artificial, has its own dangers and its own problems. There is no deadline, but there is clearly a set of very, very clear benchmarks that will allow us to withdraw and bring troops down as we go ahead.
Senator Inhofe, let me break in just to ask, how much does what has happened, the U.S. experience in Bosnia, carry over to doubts now about Kosovo?
Well, first of all, the cost. I didn't hear Ambassador Pickering say anything about the cost, and I hope that before this program's over, he will come up with a figure of how much he's willing to pay for this venture in Kosovo. Because I can remember so well in November of 1995 when we were trying to stop the deployment of the troops over to Bosnia, when the president didn't just indicate or imply but promised that the troops would be back for Christmas of 1996. That was 3 Christmases ago, and it hasn't happened yet. The cost wasn't the $2 billion they're talking about. It's now exceeded $12 billion in direct costs. And my concern, as I said, is that's coming out of our readiness, our budget. Our force strength right now is about 60% of what it was in 1991. So these deployments just aggravate the problem that already is there from a starved military budget.
Ambassador Pickering, can you answer the Senator's question as to the cost?
Yes, we've said the cost, military will have a cost between $1.5 and $2 billion a year for this particular deployment. I think it's even more important, however, to think if this problem gets out of hand and if all of Eastern Europe or certainly the lower Balkans turns into turmoil, you can imagine what the costs would be. I also want to emphasize the fact that the Europeans are bearing a very, very large share of the costs, as opposed to a 60-30 split for the United States in Bosnia, with the United States at 30%. We're now down below 15% number of troops, and obviously with respect to that, the cost burden. I think that we're getting what we have been asked to do by the Congress and others, is to get the Europeans already to pick up a larger share of the burden.
Gentlemen, we have to break in here, but when we return, I want to ask you all about what's going on with Boris Yeltsin. And we'll continue our discussion. Told President Clinton by both phone and letter, hands off Kosovo, and apparently it turns out there was no phone call and no letter. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm not sure of all the details. We're still trying to sort that out, but this is a well-known Russian position. It hasn't come as anything new. What is important is that on the 29th of January, the contact group, which includes Russia, agreed to an approach to Kosovo, including bringing the parties to negotiation, giving them a tight deadline. NATO reinforced that by saying that if the parties didn't meet the deadline, particularly if the Serbs didn't, and they seem to be lagging now, then there would be the threat of the use of force, airstrikes.
Ambassador, what I'm asking, though, is, do you think Yeltsin is fit to be president?
Well, I think Yeltsin is president of Russia. I'm not going to make a judgment about his fitness. I don't do medical diagnosis from a distance. I didn't during the Russian elections when I was there, and I'm not going to attempt to try to do that now. I think what is important, however, is he stated what Russia has said many times. What is important, however, is that Russia is working with us in cooperating in a process to get an agreement which we believe can push forward the process of building peace and stability in the Balkans.
General Jalwin, let's turn, if we can, to Iraq. The administration says it has a new policy not only to contain Saddam Hussein, but also to move to overthrow him. Do you see any real signs that that's going to work?
Well, I will refrain from the overthrow side. The commander there, General Zinni, has given his personal opinion. I am very concerned on the containment side. What happens if these weapons of mass destruction continue to be developed and his neighbors continue to be threatened? I don't know whether we've thought through a strategy that takes us to that point. But I think you have a person here, a dictator, that can truly destabilize an area of vital interest to the United States.
Senator Inhofe, do you share the General's concerns about Iraq?
Well, I'm very much concerned about Iraq. I think our foreign policy has been an absolute disaster. For the first time that I can recall, we've drawn the line in the sand and backed away 3 times. We had build-ups as we did right before Thanksgiving, and then we turned around, even though the advice of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was to go ahead and get in there and get it over with in Iraq. We pulled out. That cost about $2 billion, that one exercise. I'm not sure that Saddam Hussein or anyone in that region of the Middle East is going to believe this president.
Ambassador Pickering?
I think the people are going to believe the president. You saw what happened in the middle of December. This has helped to destabilize Saddam. If you've been watching him closely since that, he's acted in weird ways. He's been unable to protect his own people, to assure his army, as he has in the past, that he would do that. He's been lashing out at his Arab neighbors. He's threatening to overthrow people right, left, and center. He has in many ways now tried to continue to violate the no-fly zone in hopes that he can shoot down an American plane. The result, however, has been, as you indicated, he's lost 20% and perhaps more of his air defense equipment. This, of course, is an effective policy of containment.
Mr. Ambassador, there are a lot of people who disagree with the things that you've said just now. I can remember when Scott Ritter came out, and I know that he's not held in a very high regard by the administration, but he had to come out and say what was really going on. His estimate was that they are going back up now very close to the position that they were at before. And you've been watching clips, I'm sure, of the TV over there, Saddam Hussein celebrating, backing down the Americans. I'm just embarrassed about the whole thing, and I disagree with your statements.
Ambassador Pickering, we have only less than a minute left. What's the chances that 2 years, even 5 years from now, that we'll be stuck in the same standoff with Saddam Hussein?
I believe, of course, that the president has adopted a long-term strategy of regime change. It will not, as General Zinni said, happen instantly, and no one group at the moment is capable of doing that. We all agree with that. But we are engaged in a long-term plan of development of resources, people, opposition groups, bringing them together, beginning to build those who will take over the new Iraq. And we're very confident that over the term of our efforts in this regard, we can make some real progress. Obviously, dates certain in any issue as difficult as this are not clearly the kind of thing that one puts out on television, but I can tell you that our policy remains containment with a very strong and heavy new emphasis on the issue of regime change, and we will continue to do that. It took us a long time for the Cold War. It took us a long time for many other difficult problems, but patience and persistence, not usually American qualities, are the kinds of things that are best called for here.
We're going to have to end it there. Ambassador Pickering, thank you very much.
Thank
and
you.
Also General Jawin, Senator Inhofe, thank you all very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And I'll be back in a moment.